Thank you. All right. Good morning, everyone. How are y'all this fine day? It's not as rainy. That's always good. Thank you for coming back. I am delighted again to be here and to present part 4 of this 5-part lecture series on Salvador Dalí. Today, in a lot of ways, if you've been waiting to hear what the title of the series means, today is the day for that. In this 4th lecture, we're going to be talking about Dalí, what he's bringing to Surrealism at this critical juncture in 1929 into the 1930s. So to begin, in November 1929, Salvador Dalí exhibited around a dozen paintings at the Rue des Seine Gallery in Paris, for which the Surrealist leader André Breton wrote an introduction, stating, quote, "Perhaps with Dalí, this is the first time that the mental windows can open wide. Dalí's art, the most hallucinatory we know so far, constitutes a real threat. Totally new beings with obvious bad intentions have just started out. It's a dark joy to see how they pass by on their path, unhindered." I really like this quote, partly because it is clearly adulatory. We, over the course of the first lecture, to some degree, hinted at as we move forth, Breton and Dalí's relationship is not going to be the best. But here at this early stage, Breton sees Dalí as this kind of unfettered force that he's bringing to the Surrealist movement. And I like how Breton defines Dalí's work as he's exemplifying the hallucinatory aspects to his work, but also to a great degree there is this threat. There is also these bad intentions. And I think it sets up this sense of, even very early on, Breton was slightly wary about this Dalí guy. In particular, I think what Breton is seeing is that Dalí is tapping into a number of things that the Surrealists find interesting, but that he personally may have some trouble with. And also that Dalí, in many ways, is on par with Breton. He seems uncontrollable. Bear in mind how much Breton wants to control this movement, and he wants to control what Surrealism is. So this wary potential that Breton signals regarding Dalí was evident right from the start. One of his works that made a huge impression in 1929 is this painting here on the left, along with the film with Buñuel, Un Chien Andalou, which we watched and talked about last time. Dalí's painting, The Lugubrious Game, was a startling example for his brand of surrealism that he was bringing to the movement. In fact, the title of the painting was provided by the Surrealist poet, and still at the time, Gala's husband, Paul Éluard. I think it is telling that by having other Surrealists help him title this work, it shows that he's fully immersed in the movement by this point. This painting is a startling and intimate psychosexual drama, hinting at the types of interests Dalí would bring to the movement. So we have this desolate landscape far beyond this huge cluster of activity. There's a combination of naturalistic and abstracted biomorphic figures. All these things seem to reference several sexual conditions. The overly proportioned hand, right here, is often interpreted as a reference to masturbation. The bent red stem, right here, might refer to impotency. And then, most notably, the stain on the man's boxer shorts here in the foreground certainly refers to some sort of fecal stain, perhaps coprophilia. So one way we know that this painting had a kind of startling impact at this moment is due to this. This is a diagram with kind of notations produced by a kind of surrealist expat, if you will, a man by the name of Georges Bataille. Bataille would later become a kind of a huge, he has these kind of links with surrealism, but also he's considered a rival of André Breton. And Bataille, in his journal, he had just started a journal called Documents. In the third issue, produced this diagram over here where he kind of sets out to interpret Dali's painting. And I think what's interesting is he psychoanalytically, it's even in the title of this piece, psychoanalytically is analyzing Dali's painting in this sort of, as a series of reactions to castration, but castration is both horrified and sexualized. This is shown through the body in the foreground here, which he interprets as having kind of been slit open. This leads into this kind of fold up at the, this kind of swarm up at the top here that is sort of the sexual imagination of the male figure. He notes a lot of feminine traits in these objects, notably the fedoras. Here, which this is not uncommon. There's actually a series of photographs by the surrealist photographer Man Ray that is the tops of hats that are meant to sexualize how these hats look. And we see the same thing here. And then finally, Bataille himself refers to this kind of stain in the man's shorts down here as more horrified and shamed. He finds in it actually a kind of new masculinity in these sort of emotions. Bataille's reading of the painting is very Freudian in tone and approach. It's supported, again, by the title of the diagram in the journal, Psychoanalytic Diagram of the Contradictory Representations of the Subject in the Lugubrious Game by Salvador Dalí. I didn't even practice that. I just knocked that right out. Yet this painting raised some concerns, specifically with Breton. Breton famously was very experimental in his thought, but very, very conservative in his actions, and this extended to sex. When Dali proudly showed Breton this painting, Breton immediately zeroed in on this stain, and he questioned Dali about it. Dali could clearly tell that Breton was concerned. And so Dali reassured Breton by telling him that the stain was simply a simulacrum of fecal stains, that it's simply an image. Representation is not meant to be the real thing. This totally assuaged Breton. And that might sound ridiculous, but I think it sets up something that both gives us insight into how Breton thought, but it also shows us, I think, how cagey Dali was. Breton was okay. He's very cerebral. He's okay if it is simply a symbol or a metaphor. What he was really worried about was that Dali truly was coprophilic, who found sexual excitement through this. And he would not be able to handle that. Breton, this extended to a lot of things. He felt the same way about homosexuality. What is interesting is Dali, when recounting this moment later in his autobiography, he writes, quote, "But had I been pressed by Breton, I should certainly have had to answer that it was the simulacrum of excrement itself." Basically saying it is what it is. So even in this very early moment, this early stage, there is some sense of Dali. He's bringing a lot of interest and activity of the movement, but Breton feels like he can't control it. I think perhaps the most prevalent concept, let me back up, sorry. In terms of that uncontrollable quality, the fact that Bataille in his journal is writing about Dali's painting is even to some degree calls into question Dali's allegiance to Breton and the Surrealists, because Bataille, again, is seen as one of Breton's competitors. So even there is this kind of, Dali is Dali. He is almost this force, even early on, that cannot be contained. Now, perhaps the most prevalent concept Dali inserted into Surrealism at this time was his paranoiac critical method. This was first outlined in detail in the 1930 essay, The Rotting Donkey, published in the first issue of the Surrealist New Journal I mentioned a few lectures ago, Surrealism in the Service of the Revolution. In the essay, Dali presents paranoid hallucinations and responses to events as an active force. Quote, "Paranoia uses the external world as a means to assert the obsessive idea with its disturbing characteristic of making this idea's reality valid to others. The reality of the external world serves as illustration and proof and is placed in the service of the reality of our mind." I just want to point out what he's doing here. Note the parallels first with going way back to the first lecture, Breton's description of a surreality, as he describes it in the first manifesto. Breton describes a surreality as those moments where our internal reality and the external world blend and merge. The way that Dali thinks about paranoia is very similar, because Dali sees it as an activating force. Think about how a paranoid person responds to the world. If you suffer from paranoia, everything you witness and see in the world refers back to you. Dali takes this concept and begins to see it not as something that one would suffer from, but something that one might actively engage with in the external world and begin to make others perceive the world in that way. It's a very, very fascinating idea. And many scholars have pointed out that Dali's conception of the paranoiac critical method was his response to the earlier surrealist fascination with automatism. Dali basically began to feel that automatism dominated early surrealism. And it took that concept of what, say, the surreality was trying to do, and it makes it passive, right? It is about emptying your mind and letting the subconscious kind of percolate up, and then it manifests out into words or image that are in many ways uncontrolled, that are pre-conscious thought. Dali did not like that idea. He wants something that is not passive but active, and the paranoid critical method is meant to do that. I think it is interesting at this early stage, though, because he's writing this in 1930. He's still fairly new within the movement. When he writes The Rotting Donkey, he does make a concession in the introduction by stating this new focus on paranoia should be used, quote, simultaneously with automatism and other passive states, unquote. So he's basically throwing in that it's not trying to get rid of automatism, it should be used in tandem with it. But the active quality to applying paranoia is manifested through the double image. Dali stresses this in the Rotting Donkey essay. Dali explains that this double image can not only replace the obsessive idea driving the paranoia, but can further generate more multiple images and a kind of ongoing chain of obsessions being replaced with imagery. So as Shelley DeMaria argues in the catalog for this show, this realization of the paranoid critical method as manifested with the double image was perhaps realized at the earliest in this 1933 painting that is just upstairs, the Phantom Cart. As the cart we see heading towards the city, if you look through the cart, you begin to realize that what you think is the man, the driver, and the head of the horse are actually architecture in the city skyline. They are both things simultaneously. And again, DeMaria argues that this is probably one of these very early visual explorations of that type of double image in his work. But I want to take it a little further, and I think that's because typically when we think of the paranoid critical method, and this is due to Dali, particularly Dali later in the 1930s, definitely into the 1940s, really begins to tighten the link between paranoid critical method as a process and the double image in his paintings. It goes well beyond that, though. And it is in the third issue of that new Surrealist journal, Surrealism in the Service of the Revolution, from 1931, that Dali further explores and I think takes further the full potential of the paranoiac critical method. In an essay titled Communication, Visage Paranoiaque, Dali recounts his experience coming across a photograph on his desk of what he took to be a Picasso painting. So he says he came across this photo here, and then over here he's kind of tightened what he saw, and it looks like a face of a painting by Picasso in a kind of very, almost post-cubist abstract period of Picasso. It is only when Dali turns the painting on its side that he realizes, oh, no, wait, it is actually a photograph of people in front of an African village. So the double, I know, it's like all of our brains just exploded. It is the double image here, but what fascinates him is that it's not a double image he concocted. It is a double image he experienced out in the world. In this essay, he takes it further, though, because he takes the photograph, now turned back this way, right? Do you see it? Here's the village, right? If you turn it this way, here are the eyes, here's the nose, here are the lips, here's the shadow between the bottom lip and the chin, right here. Keep in mind this little, this is like a cheek right here. Just keep this in mind for just a moment, because he takes this image to André Breton and he shows it to him. And he doesn't set him up. He's like, what do you see in this? And Breton says, well, I see a face. So bingo, they both see faces. But then Dali presses him further and asks Breton what kind of face. Remember, Breton sees a Picasso painting. Dali sees a Picasso painting. Breton looks at it and says, I see the Marquis de Sade. Notice if you look over here, see the way this in the background looks like a wig? So Breton sees the Marquis de Sade. This is important because what Dali is doing is he's transferring the paranoid critical method from, say, a visual technique into an interpretive model. And that is really what the paranoid critical method in this stage becomes. It is about seeing, to some degree, double images in the world, and through the process of interpreting them using this kind of paranoid model, the way the person interprets things speaks as much about them as a person, and they're externalizing their internal thoughts and obsessions and ideas through the way they process these images. There's also one more important distinction here, as the scholar Don Aids notes, and that is Dali is at pains to elaborate that this process does not feature dreams. Dali doesn't care about dreams. He doesn't want to depict or paint dreams. He is about focusing on his own obsessions and psychological states and memories. It is not about dreams. And again, he feels that automatism and early surrealism is obsessed with these kind of dream states. So he's trying to move beyond that, and the paranoid critical method is a key aspect to that. Excuse me. There is a desire to equate Dali's paranoid critical method, again, with the kind of double image in his paintings. But it's this interpretive model that he really begins exploring in the early 1930s. And this is best shown in a very ongoing series of writings and essays and documents that he writes, all focused on this painting on the left, Millet's The Angelus, from 1857 to 1859. I had brought this up in the second lecture, and I said, keep in mind we're going to see this again, so here you go. If you recall, the reason I brought it up in the second lecture is in Dali's autobiography, the first one, Secret Life. He has a whole passage about how when he was a young child, a reproduction of this painting hung outside the classroom, and he just became obsessed with this kind of image of this, it's a very wistful, also a very mournful image of a peasant man and woman standing in this kind of agricultural setting, praying. And he just became obsessed with this. And then he claims he forgot about it and only rediscovered it around 1930 when he saw the painting again, and the flood of memories came back to him. And not just the memories, but the emotions this painting instilled in him, the terror and the hauntingness of it. It all kind of came back. So he begins writing about this painting again. And most notably, he applies his paranoiac critical method in the way that he's interpreting these images. The first of these is in a he writes in an invitation to an exhibition of drawings that he contributed to a new collection of a book by the late 19th century writer the Surrealists adored, Lautréamont. Lautréamont's book, The Chants de Meadows, or The Songs of Meadows. This book was one that, even way back in the first manifesto, Breton kind of, holds up as a pre-surrealist exemplary novel. And here, Dali has been asked to, they're going to publish a new edition of it, and he's been asked to create illustrations for it. So in the exhibition for that, he writes his kind of introduction to it, where he talks about his drawings for it and how he is inspired by this famous line in Lautréamont's book that the Surrealists are obsessed, quote, "the chance encounter on a dissecting table of a sewing machine and an umbrella." And this one passage in particular, the Surrealists love because it speaks to the kind of irrational juxtaposition of real things, right? In whatever situation would you come across a dissecting table with an umbrella and a sewing machine on it, And yet he incorporates that into the book, and the Surrealists are just, they really just almost obsess over this one passage again and again. You can find many different Surrealist works of art that refer to that one passage. Dali begins with that passage in this brief essay, and he extends the metaphor by referencing Millet's Angelus. He begins to describe them, for instance, as the umbrella and the sewing machine, and in particular, making those gender specific. So the umbrella is the man, the sewing machine is the woman. He hints at umbrella as related to male erections. There's a lot. He begins to kind of dive more deeply into seeing a lot of these sort of sexual aspects to this. And notice, if you read this early essay, the way that he just continues diving deeper and deeper and deeper becomes a legitimizing way of him describing in The Rotting Donkey the kind of ongoing chain of obsessive links that he referred to. So here, for instance, he begins to reference the plowed land behind him. And he says, quote, "This desolate, crepuscular, and deadly environment plays in this painting the role of the dissecting table in the poetic text. For not only does life fade away on the horizon, but there is also a pitchfork plunged into the real and substantial meat that the plowed land had been for man through all time. It sinks into it, I say, with the intentionality avid for fecundity that is peculiar to the delicious incisions of a surgical knife." End quote. The analysis goes on from there. I'm not going to go as far as he does, but he basically continues to focus on the male-female relationship in this painting as akin to that of a praying mantis and then eating its partner after copulating. Even seeing the face of Napoleon in the sky behind them. I encourage you all to now focus on finding that face of Napoleon. And I say that partly jokingly, but also just to point out that what Dali is attempting to do here is the minute you're reading that essay and you start thinking of this couple now in much more of a kind of sexual relationship way, and then you take it further and you start thinking of the idea of a praying mantis copulating with its partner and then eating its partner, and then you start looking for that face of Napoleon in the background. Notice what you're doing. You're looking at this painting the way that Dali's interpreting it. And that is that externalizing force that he's talking about. Suddenly you're almost thinking about it the same way that he is. He is validating, I just made up a word, validating his internal interpretation of this painting by pushing it out into the real world. And all of us begin to think, maybe not all of us, some of us, begin looking at the painting in that way. This is that active aspect of the paranoid critical method that he is bringing to surrealism at this time. It is clear that Dali invested a great deal of thought and importance into this paranoid critical interpretation, both generally but specifically with Millet's Angelus. The historian Don Ades, again, has noted that this brief essay spun out of a book-length analysis he was writing around 1933 to 1934 that was not published. And it was finally published in 1963. So, just the idea that he's working on this in a book-length form at this time shows just his own interest and obsession in this process as applied to, just going to back up, to this painting in particular. But Dali applied the paranoid critical method as, again, an interpretive model in more nuanced ways. There is an essay in the mid-1930s for a partly surrealist edited journal called Minotaur, in which Dali analyzes this anonymous photograph that we see here on the left. On its own, the image is disturbing enough. The first time I saw it, I'm like, wow, that is a creepy image. You have this sort of gentleman kind of emerging from this dark, shadowy doorway. There are these two women standing on the step in front. And as Dali writes about this photograph, though, he doesn't know who took it. He just came across it. What is remarkable to him was not, as he put it, quote, the climate of criminality surrounding the three individuals, unquote, but what he focuses in on is the stark white, empty, naked spool down here in the far bottom left. Do you see it? That is what he kind of zooms in on in this analysis. He takes this even further. He, for instance, begins to talk about how this minor aspect of the overall image, he contrasts this kind of Euclidean or flat geometric positioning of the figures, right? The way they're in this kind of flat rectangular alcove with the, as he calls it, non-Euclidean or curved forms of the spool down here. I mean, it gets really, really intense. But notice, it's like those moments when, I don't know if you've experienced this, you're writing and suddenly you just stop and you look at a word and you're like, that word doesn't look right, right? And then you like look it up. You're like, no, I spelled it right. Like, it just doesn't look right. It's that moment of frisson where something happening in our brain is, again, kind of being validated by what we're seeing in the world. How many of you now can no longer not look at this down here, right? It is there, and we can't not see it. But if I hadn't pointed it out, and by I mean Dali, if Dali had not pointed it out, you may not have even noticed it. And this, again, is another aspect of that paranoid critical method. It's not just about double imagery. It's about the way that we interpret the things that we see. And here Dali is just kind of zooming in on this one minor facet to explore this kind of very wonderfully strange kind of geometric mathematical concept that he plays with. You may have noticed in the passages I've been quoting so far that for the most part, Dali's tone in these paranoid critical essays from the early 1930s sounds very clinical. If you read them, they do not feel like the kind of strangely poetic and self-obsessed writings that we find in Dali's, even kind of pre-surrealist writings or his, much later autobiography. These are, they read like scientific papers. And that, in a lot of ways, is intentional. Historian Astrid Rufa links Dali's avid readings of scientific journals and his knowledge of psychoanalytic theories to his own pre-surrealist anti-art mentality of the period, between 1926 and 1928, in the sense that the anti-art is deliberately emulating kind of scientific, his writing here deliberately emulates scientific papers. This references a kind of older stylistic practice, both pre-modern to a certain degree, or kind of against modernism. That's part of that kind of anti-art aspect to Dali. But also, it references back to an early surrealist model, right? Think back again to the first lecture where I talked about the early Surrealist journal mimicked the look and feel of La Nature, the preeminent science journal in Paris at the time. Dali is, with the paranoiac critical method, this even extends to the name of it, right? It sounds like this hard to pronounce, overly complex medical term. He is trying to bring back this kind of scientific sensibility to Surrealist practice. He's quite successful with it. After publishing a number of these very early paranoiac critical essays, he is approached by the very young psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Jacques Lacan had written some brief essays about paranoia that Dali drew from directly, and he credits Lacan and Freud in The Riding Donkey with these sort of concepts that he is building off of. Lacan becomes aware of this and reads Dali's essays. He's like, this is accurate. Like, this does really it does really build off of what he had been working on. And so Dali and Lacan meet and talk, and later Lacan will kind of expand on his ideas about paranoia, and many critics have noted that it is in some ways kind of legitimizing Dali's own ideas with the paranoiac critical method. They became lifelong friends. I don't know the exact date of this photo. My suspicion it's probably in the late 1950s, maybe early 60s. Scott, do you know? Yeah, and Lacan here is also older and his hair is white, but I mean, they were friends kind of throughout their lives. I like to bring that up for two reasons. One is because, I think when we tend to think of Dali, we think of the public persona that he presented. He was very brilliant, and he was very well read in a lot of psychoanalytic theory. He knew Freud, not personally, but he knew Freud's writings very well. He knew this young upstart named Lacan and his ideas about paranoia. He is building off of these things. And Lacan, recognizing that, is a legitimization of Dali and Surrealist practice in general. That aside, you could imagine how both excited and nonplussed Breton was, because he could never get someone like Freud to understand what Surrealism was. I recall, or I mentioned that in the first lecture. It will come up again next time as well. This kind of scientific, let's say even maybe pseudo-scientific aspect extends to other types of art forms that Dali is working on at the time as well. On the left is a piece he made in 1933, this photo montage called The Phenomenon of Ecstasy. And it's a startling kind of collage, a kind of compilation of close-up photos of mainly women's faces, there's a man here, of them in a kind of ecstatic state. On one hand, we're meant to kind of read these images as the emotion and psychological and to a great degree erotic aspect of ecstasy. But by just zooming in on their faces, it doesn't become erotic or sexual per se. It is more about the individual in that state. And this kind of clinical tone, again, is enhanced by just this line of ears right here, and there's some more up here as well, that makes it look like you're looking at almost a sort of physiognomic study of different people's ears. I mean, it is meant to feel very much like a case study, like this is data. And I think that's even heightened by the fact that the one image that is, I think, most obviously pornographic in nature down here is, first off, the one that does not just zoom in on only one face. It shows a group of faces, but also the one that there is no clear expression of ecstasy. Notice, though, and many scholars have written about this piece and pointed out that if you're also thinking of, say, famous works of art like Bernini's Ecstasy of St. Teresa, that is probably intentional. Keep in mind how much Dali respects and reveres traditional art. And so he is referencing and pulling from that here as well. In particular, I mean, faces like, this is actually a sculpture, of course, here, but these faces make you think that kind of ecstatic face of St. Teresa from Bernini's very famous Baroque sculpture. So this shift back towards a kind of psychological and scientific model is evident. And the historian Catherine Connolly has described that in the more science-focused images and writings included in this newer journal, Minotaur, which Breton was asked to co-edit with his Surrealist expat and person he didn't much care for, Georges Bataille. There was a lot of this sort of scientific focus in that journal. In the combined third and fourth issues, which featured, as Connolly points out, 5 articles on psychology, one of which was by Jacques Lacan. It also included in this double issue this image on the right of a page of these evocative and mysterious photographs of close-ups of found objects by the Hungarian-born photographer Beset. That I think, due to the intentionality of how he lights them and kind of zooming in on them, he transforms these just simple found objects, trash you might find on the street, into, as he calls them, involuntary sculptures. So we have, the way that he lights this kind of rolled up thing here, and we have no idea what this is here, and oh my God, is that a tooth? It's all these types of kind of enigmatic things. Now, when it was published, there are captions underneath each of these. And by most accounts, it has never, as far as I can tell, never been confirmed. But by most accounts, these are most likely written by Dali. Dali and Beset were partnering on this and kind of a couple other projects at this time. And I think what is interesting about these captions, I'm just going to read you a few of them as translated. These are all on the left side going down, right? So we're going to start here. The caption reads, "Symmetrically rolled bus ticket, very rare form of morphological automatism with evident seeds of stereotyping." This one down here. "The most frequent characteristics of the quote-unquote modern style." And then finally down here, "A piece of soap presenting the automatic forms of modern style found in a bathroom." Notice a few things about these captions. One, they often demystify the objects. He names what they are: rolled up bus ticket, piece of soap, right? So in identifying them, in some senses, he's subverting and undoing what Beset is doing in the photographs by trying to mystify them, to turn them into these involuntary sculptures. But then also notice he takes on a tone that is, well, intentionally referencing style. He talks about a modern style. He talks about characteristics. But it is also a tone that is very critical, uninvested. It sounds very academic. This kind of very distant tone that he takes on. This, in a lot of ways, is another aspect to that kind of scientific approach that Dali is reinvesting. And he's not alone in this. I mean, he comes in at a time where Surrealism, to a certain degree, is trying to do this as well. But he's simply adding to it. So despite the kind of resonant impact Dali's paranoiac critical method had on both his paintings and helping refocus the ideological interests of the movement during this period, it is with his work beyond painting, be it an interpretation with those photographs, or most likely with the types of objects that are going to be made in the early 1930s, that the legacy of where Surrealism goes in that decade is most seen. The Surrealist object is a term that encompasses a broad range of sculpture types. I just want to point that out. It could be sculptures that are very intricately crafted in certain ways. Giacometti makes a number of these. But in its kind of purest sense, these are Surrealist objects that refer to, as the historian and writer Maurice Nadeau describes them, quote, any alienated object, one out of its habitual context, used for purposes different from those for which it was intended, or whose purpose is unknown. I like to think of Surrealist objects in this kind of pure sense as they are often found objects or acquired objects. They are objects that were made in the world for a purpose we all recognize. And then the Surrealists come along and modify them or subvert them or recontextualize them in a way that, as Nadeau says, their original purpose is denied or mystified. And as Mark Palizzati has claimed, quote, no doubt the greatest inspiration behind these objects, and one of their most prolific inventors, was Salvador Dalí. Very few of Dali's Surrealist objects, these kind of assemblages he was making in 1932, 33, 34, completely survive. A lot of them survive just through photographs or through statements and descriptions of them. But it's clear he is concocting these objects that are really, really, they just resonate with you. I'm just going to describe a few of them. These are both from around 1932, 33. As exhibited. One was a woman's shoe that contained a glass of warm milk into which a sugar cube painted with an image of a woman's shoe is slowly dipped until it dissolves. Another one was a dinner jacket covered in shot glasses filled again with milk. This object you see on the left is not that one. It is a variation of it that he produced around 1936 called the Aphrodisiac's jacket. And he would remake this object again and again over the course of his career. One is filled with absinthe. One he wore to parties. So the Surrealist objects increasingly became one of the primary visual outputs of the group during this decade of the 1930s, featuring with increasing frequency and dominance in Surrealist exhibitions organized in England and Paris, among other venues as well. And they were important because since they relied on found objects and the assemblage technique, anyone could make them. That is one of the things that is most fascinating about the Surrealist objects. Not everyone could make a Dali painting. That takes a lot of talent. Dali can make a Dali painting, but anyone can make these Surrealist objects. Notice this sense of anyone being able to participate yet again goes back to the origins of Surrealism. Think back to automatic writing. Think back to the games like The Exquisite Corpse. The idea was these should be activities that any Surrealist can partake in. And in fact, Breton himself, after the kind of popularity of the Surrealist object took off, he himself began making this long series of objects he called poem objects. They were a kind of hybrid of assemblage objects and poems that he would assemble together. There's a huge number of these that he made over the course of the next 15, 20 years. This is one here where we have, I think this is like a moth or a butterfly specimen, but it has bird wings painted on it. This looks to be a kind of fractured or broken photograph or part of a tile, perhaps. This is an egg with the words, I see, I imagine, painted on it. And then this is the poem itself pasted down here. This is from 1935. This is from around 1936. I would argue that an even more important facet to the Surrealist object, and we'll see more of these in the last lecture as well, is that it further relates to the same shift from the passive to the active, from the internal to the external, that is evident in Dali's paranoiac critical method. Surrealist objects are unlike automatic drawings or even surrealist paintings in that they begin with real objects that exist in the world for a purpose. And the surrealists transform them into objects that become representative of a highly individualized mentality. Surrealist objects exist. They are three-dimensional. You can touch them. If they're at a museum, don't, but you can. They are real things you can hold and use. And so in this way, they are in essence quite similar to the way that Dali's conception of paranoia is about externalizing phenomena that we see and spreading that out for people to experience as well. Surrealist objects often try to do the same thing. They are real things in the world that have been modified and changed in this very surrealistic way. Now, in spite of these revitalized interests in psychology, science, sexuality, and other interests within the Surrealist movement, Dali's emergence into the group as a primary member did cause stress due to his own unique and disturbing interests. In 1933, for instance, this is still fairly early, the Surrealists held a trial of Dali at Breton's home after Dali increasingly expressed a fascination with Adolf Hitler. This is 33, so Hitler has just become Chancellor of Germany. I think it's interesting that when things have been brewing for, a month or so, and finally the Surrealists, led by Breton, call Dali to Breton's house for this trial, and they cite not just his fascination with Hitler, but I think it's interesting, they also cite his fascination with academic art, right? So this interest in older pre-modern art, they're like, that's also a problem. By accounts from those in attendance at this trial, Dali survived the trial. He showed up claiming to not feel well. He was wearing a massive jacket and he had a thermometer in his mouth. And for the next few hours, he just perpetually defended himself in almost this kind of stream of consciousness way while he kept claiming he didn't feel well. So he took off his jacket and he was wearing a massive sweaters, and he would take one sweater off and say, I'm too hot, take another sweater off. And he would take off these layers of sweaters until he was just bare-chested. And then he would say, I'm getting cold, and he would put them back on again. And he did this the entire time. He's just pontificating about in defense of himself. And by most accounts, he just out-Breton. Like, Breton could not get a word in edgewise to kind of fully just throw him out of the movement at this point. And so he stayed in, and he would really be in for until about 1936. But there are other things here as well that are happening. A lot of Dali's images and paintings and interests that we see showing up in his work, this is occurring at the same time that despite everything I've been saying, Breton is still trying to partner with the Communist Party. He desperately wants this alliance. And the Surrealists will be called before the Communist Party, and they'll bring up, well, this new Surrealist from Spain you have, Dali, he has a painting where a guy has fecal stained shorts. Like, what is up with that? And Breton finds himself having to defend Dali to the communists. And here's the important thing. He always defends him, supporting him, and increasingly begins to see that because of this, in some ways, the Surrealists and the communists are not going to ever be able to partner. The more he gets called to the floor by the communists because of Dali and other actions, it's not just Dali, the more Breton becomes just to realize this is never going to work. And this will officially kind of come to a head around 1935 when Trotsky is thrown out and Breton allies himself with Trotsky, not with Stalin. And so, that is the official rift, not with communism and socialism, but with the Communist Party that occurs. And to some degree, Dali is part and parcel of this. Just to kind of end with this point of tension between them, or between these two things, this was leading to people leaving the Surrealist movement who were more fully committing themselves to the Communist Party. Breton's longtime friend and colleague, Louis Aragon, was increasingly, partly due to his wife, allying himself with the Communist Party and moving up in the ranks of the party as well. And in fact, I bring this photograph of Dali's back because at the exhibit where Dali's original dinner jacket with shot glasses of milk was shown, Aragon took umbrance at this and apparently later complained to Dali and Breton that, quote, that milk was, quote, it was wasted milk that could have been used to feed destitute children. And at this point, it began to become clear to Breton that even his good old friend Louis Aragon was no longer seeing the purpose of Surrealism. He had so fully allied himself with the Communist Party cause. So, as we will explore next time in the final lecture, Dali's travels to the United States to promote Surrealism and his own work, naturally, would ultimately begin to redefine for a much broader population what Surrealism was, leading to an irreparable rift with Breton and the Surrealist movement itself. So next time we will conclude. Thank you. And I'm happy to take any